What is up, enthusiasts? It is Cedar Flags here, and welcome back to another one of my videos. Before I start, I just want to thank you all for the amazing success my channel has gone through lately, but anyway, let's get right to the video. There have been few roller coasters that have amazed me as much as Skyrush at Hersheypark. Skyrush at Hersheypark is an intimate hypercoaster that has wing seats and a pretty interesting layout, even for a hypercoaster. So today I'm going to get into the review of Skyrush, tell you about my thoughts on it, the full experience, and the overall rating. So let's get right into it. So before I start, I just want to say that this is one of my most ridden coasters outside of my home park. I rode this coaster a grand total of 16 times in the course of 1.5 days. Now, I don't know if this is a normal thing outside of 2020, but during this year at least, the lines for both Fahrenheit and Candymonium were longer than the lines for Skyrush. The entire day, Skyrush was a complete walk-on with the exception of the front row line. But at the same time, it was really nice to lap the ride. But let's start off this full experience review, starting off with the front gate. When you look at the front gate, you could basically see everything that's a part of the ride. You could see the front entrance, the queue, the station, and you could easily tell that this coaster is not very themed. If you have ridden Candymonium, that has a pretty decent amount of theming in the queue, everything's indoors, and it just looks great. Skyrush is pretty generic, but at the same time, it doesn't need to be extremely themed. Skyrush's theme is basically just launching towards the sky, and at the same time, you get some of the most intense airtime ever, so I guess it fits the theme in a way. The queue is pretty generic as well, just a bunch of switchbacks and cattle pins. Fortunately, I didn't get to wait in any of those cattle pins, I just got to experience the stairs. And basically, a weird part of this ride that I really haven't seen on any other ride is that you have two choices once you reach that stair area. You either get to go in the front row or choose any other row, second to back. Now, the front row line was always a little bit congested, but the middle to back row line was always empty. So most of the time I just lapped the middle to back row line because my favorite row on this ride is actually the back, and I'll get to that later. But the stairs are also pretty generic. You get some pretty good views of the ride's lift, and then you go into the station. Now this is a very weird station. You might be asking me why, but it is actually a one-way station, which means that you enter and exit off of the same side. Now they have it regulated, which actually surprised me because it would be pretty confusing to figure that out. But basically when it comes to dispatches, they allow the people on the previous ride to exit first through the side, and then they allow the people getting on the ride to enter through the gates. So the gates are pretty nice. It's a pretty nice station, not too congested or confusing like some other stations. I do like how the front row line is completely separated because when you go somewhere, especially like Cedar Point, you can see that some of those front row waits congest a lot of the station and might even form an artificial line. The reason this is a one-sided station is only because Comet is right on the other side, and it would be very tricky to figure out how to exit through that area. Something great about this ride, and actually every other ride at Hersheypark, is that there are bins on the ride platforms. Now, it was a little confusing because the bins were actually on our side, the people entering the ride, as opposed to the other side of the station. But like I said, it's a one-sided station. So, here's my first extremely controversial opinion on this ride, and it's actually good. So you get into the trains, you pull down the restraints, and a lot of people really do not like these restraints. Some of them even say they hurt, some of them say they're painful, and this ride has gotten the nickname Thigh Crush. Well, let me just say, earlier this year, I got to ride T3 for the first time, and guys, you know what I'm talking about. This is an extremely painful ride, and I cannot handle that thing. The entire ride, I was screaming in agony, and I'm a bigger guy, so it might have even affected me more. So when people said that Skyrush had painful restraints, I was a little nervous. So I pull down the restraints, and I make sure to pull them down as hard as possible so they don't tighten during the ride, and I realized these restraints aren't painful whatsoever. Do they squeeze on your thighs? Yeah, of course. But do they hurt? Absolutely not. You barely even notice the pain during the ride. You don't necessarily think about it as opposed to how amazing the ride is, and it's actually one of my favorite restraints on any roller coaster. And besides, with that first drop, you need to be squeezed to your restraint. The first part of this ride that caught me by surprise was definitely the fact that the lift hill was extremely fast. It reminded me something more like Maverick at Cedar Point, even though it wasn't even a launch. But this thing is fast. It takes you up that 200-foot lift hill at an extremely fast speed, and before you even know it, you're at the top of the hill. It feels like a part of the ride experience as opposed to a lift chain. Now this next part I'm talking about is seriously one of my favorite moments on any roller coaster ever. Remember back in July when I was talking about Lightning Run at Kentucky Kingdom and how that second to last airtime hill was the most intense airtime experience I've ever experienced? Well, let me just say that Skyrush's first drop easily takes the cake for the single most intense airtime moment I have ever experienced, especially if you are sitting in the back row. Something weird about this first drop is that you start off slowly curving over that lift hill, but you start to drop, and the drop honestly feels pretty normal, like a B&M Hyper, something like Millennium Force at Cedar Point or I-305, stuff like that. It feels like a normal drop. But the Skyrush riders watching this, you know exactly what I'm talking about. There is this jolt halfway through the first drop, right after you start to curve, and that is one of the most insane moments of airtime ever. You are just slowly lifting out of your seat, and then suddenly you are launched out of your seat at such an alarming speed, and you feel like you are flying out. This airtime moment is the single most insane airtime moment I've ever experienced. This moment is especially spiced up in the back row. In the back row, it is truly unthought of. You are ejected out of that row, and it is truly incredible. But anyway, right after that drop is that insane right-hand turn that gave me a lot of Intimidator 305 vibes, even though it wasn't as long and drawn out. Another unpopular opinion I have on this ride is the fact that the wing seats are not painful in my opinion. I do have a few friends who have said that the wing seats are a little painful. I just found them to be a little more intense. These wing seats at this moment completely whip you around like a rag doll. It is truly insane, and not for everyone, but a few people really like it. The next element on the ride is an incredible Camelback, and I cannot even begin to describe how incredibly insane this Camelback is. You go on it thinking that you might get a little bit of floater, maybe some ejector, but you are completely launched out of your seat instantly, smacking into that lap bar at hypercoaster speeds. This is such an insane Camelback, and it feels like you haven't lost a bit of speed since you got on that first drop. You completely zoom over this airtime hill, and when you look at POVs or when you look at off-ride shots, it doesn't look that forceful. But let me say, no matter what row you're in, front, back, middle, you are going to be launched out of your seat during this moment. And frankly, every other airtime moment on this ride. After that is this incredible left-hand turn. And let me say, this is the turn that got me. I got some incredible grayouts on this turn. And let me just say, that long, drawn-out moment, this turn, is truly insane and not for the faint of heart. You actually get some head choppers with the trees if you're sitting in certain wing seats, which I find pretty cool. After that is another Camelback, similar to the first one, and this is actually rumored to pull -2 Gs of force. Now let me say I did find the first drop more intense, and usually the feeling doesn't match up with the statistics in my personal opinion. For example, they say boomerangs are more forceful than Intimidator 305, but I find Intimidator 305 more forceful. But anyway, this second airtime moment is just like the first. You are completely whipped out of your seat at this moment, and it is truly one incredible moment. Now let me say those two matching Camelbacks that cross each other are not as intense as the first drop in my opinion. A lot of people say that these two Camelbacks are the two strongest airtime moments on Skyrush, and that is another unpopular opinion I personally have. I think that first drop is truly the king of elements on this ride, but these two Camelbacks are still insane, and if we're placed on an RMC, would definitely be the most intense airtime moments on that ride. Right after that Camelback, you whip right into another right-hand turn. Now this is not as intense as the second turn, but a little more intense than that first turn, and so you transition right into a Stengel dive, which somehow, if you're sitting in a wing seat, gives you crazy ejector airtime. You know, on rides like Maverick, you don't experience airtime on the Stengel dives, and I don't know how Skyrush does it, but you experience like a little bit of airtime on this moment. It's truly insane. And after that, you go into another turn, another extremely forceful turn. Like I said, all of these moments are incredible and forceful. There is not a bland moment on this ride. And after that, you go into one of the craziest airtime moments on this ride, not because of the force of it, but because of the whip. If you are sitting on a wing seat, this is one of the most intense moments of any ride you'll ever experience, and the laterals are truly worth knowing. But basically, you go into an off-axis hill. It reminds me a lot of that hill a few times after the mid-course brake run, where you transition from one bank to another. It's basically a switch bend on an airtime hill, and it is truly incredible. You whip from one side up to the other while being ejected out of your seat. And of course, if you're sitting in one of the center seats, it's still not that bad of an element. It's still extremely intense no matter where you're sitting. But yes, this will whip you from side to side. After that is another airtime moment, the final ejector airtime moment on the ride. This moment is truly intense as well. It's not long, it's not drawn out, but it is strong, it is tiny, and at the speed you're going, that ejector airtime is truly insane. I actually talked to a few people marathoning it that this is their favorite moment on the ride because of the force, and while I disagree, this is still truly an intense moment no matter where you're sitting. After that is another turn, this one being pretty forceless, and a little bit of a dip, pretty forceless as well. The ride is basically over after that last airtime moment, and you go into a little bit of a trim brake, you make a little right-hand turn, and you go into the block brake of the ride that slows you to a complete stop. The ride is over in much less than a minute. This is a short ride when it comes to duration, and I'll explain that later. But anyway, you're on the brake run. The first time I've ever experienced this is on Skyrush. You are sitting there on the brake run, especially if the ride is running 2 train ops. If the ride is running 1 train ops, you will not experience this, but if they're having dispatches in the station and you're waiting at the last brake run, your restraints will actually loosen up a little bit and might even go off of your lap, which with the complaints of the restraints of this ride, that is very reasonable. But anyway, that is Skyrush at the one and only Hersheypark in Hershey, Pennsylvania. Now let me just say, when I said an airtime moment wasn't as intense as another airtime moment, all of these airtime moments were extremely strong. The weakest airtime moments resembled the strongest airtime moments on some RMCs. If there is something that I love about this ride and that lacks in other really good rides such as like Fury 325, Intimidator 305, or even one of my personal favorites, Millennium Force at Cedar Point, is that there is not one forceless element on this ride. While this ride is extremely short, this ride packs every single element with such good pace and such good charm. If this ride were a little longer, I might be complaining about that exact same thing. But since this ride only has very few elements on it, every single last element fulfills its purpose in such an extreme way. And I love roller coasters that have their own niche, which have their own cult following. Rides like Steel Vengeance, which I personally love, Lightning Rod, Fury 325, The Voyage at Holiday World, Ejanica, X2, rides like that, they all have a specific cult following, and I truly love how this ride sticks to what it's good at, being short but packing every single element with force. There are a lot of rides that have a few elements that lack, but every single element on this ride packs. And I know people that like this ride much more than Fury or Steel Vengeance or rides like that, and at the same time, they just love the consistency of the ride. They love how every element on the ride packs a different punch, and that is something that really put this up on the rankings for me. Now, I do prefer this over Intimidator 305 at King's Dominion, just because I'm more of an airtime guy, but I put this below Maverick at Cedar Point. And this is my only complaint about the ride, it is pretty short. The thing I love about Maverick is that it keeps its consistency and its duration as well with that second launch. Now this ride is still phenomenal, it is in my top 10, but at the same time, it could have been a longer ride, but once again, it could have had forceless elements if it continued on. So this is one of those few rides that I would consider near perfect. I personally like duration more, but I know a good majority of the people out there, including some close friends, would much rather have a short, intense, consistent ride than a long ride with a bunch of surprises within it. But anyway, that is my review on Skyrush. If I were to get this a final score, I would say overall, it would be a 10. Yes, I put Skyrush at a perfect 10, and the only reason I say that is even though I don't think it's my favorite coaster, I think it succeeds at what it was aimed to succeed at, which was its own niche, its own cult following, and I truly believe that it succeeded. This ride is one of the most intense roller coasters on Earth, definitely one of the most intense I've experienced, and that first drop still gets me every single time. But anyway, if you've ridden Skyrush, tell me what you think about it. If you haven't ridden Skyrush and are anticipating it, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Anyways, this is Cedar Flags, and I will see you all later.